This is a Guide Your Light network production, creating podcasts with purpose.
During those travels that I was describing, there would be those incredible moments with those communities, but there were also other moments that were less dreamy. For instance, going to Borneo and seeing the vast hectares upon hectares of palm oil plantations and realizing the degradation that was happening because of those to old growth forests, or snorkeling on a reef there and seeing that actually it was all dead. And this was because of the warming of the ocean and because of fishing techniques, all these sorts of things. And so I was receiving little kind of nudges about how our kind of consumptive behaviors were impacting upon the planet. But I suppose at that point, I wasn't willing to look at my contribution to that. I would just say, isn't this awful? Okay, it's good to be aware of it and just continue on. Now, all of that changed when I went to the Arctic.
Hello, I'm Maritza Barone. Welcome to the Things You Can't Unhear podcast. Has there ever been a moment in your life where you heard, read, or were told something that you simply could not unhear?
Something that made you stop in your tracks and helped you to see the world differently in some way, a better way. On this podcast, we create those life-changing moments for you through interviews with some of the world's most profound people around the globe. We explore groundbreaking ideas in health and well-being.
What we're really doing is getting to the root cause of your symptoms. And often we find that that is an emotional block that we have been carrying around in our body that's become almost crystallized and created a physical symptom.
Relationships.
And for women as well, when I talk about respect, it's called respecting yourself, which is don't overgive. Women will tend to put themselves one down, and then wake up at 40 and go, wait a second, I am woman, I deserve respect.
Personal and professional transformation.
This is true of any skill. You only develop it by doing it. And so, if you don't get out there and just start doing it and being a bit rough around the edges at the beginning, you can't work on your craft. And so it can't turn into something.
Spirituality.
Because I think when we know who we really are, we think we're our name and our body and our form and our hair and our clothes and our skin and but when we know who we really are as infinite beings, we're free.
And so much more. So settle in. This might just be a big day for you where you hear something that changes your life in the most transformative way. Hello and welcome back to the show. Now, be prepared to have that travel spark lit within you from this conversation today. I've invited Nina Karnikowski to the show. She's an author and travel writer and the author of several books, including her memoir, The Mindful Traveler. Over her career, she has traveled to more than 80 countries and found the most richness in niche and remote locations, which she has become known for as a writer. These days, she writes about travel that conserves, educates, and uplifts, which she calls conscious traveling. Her travel awakening happened while she was on an assignment she took to the Canadian Arctic in late 2019, which she shares with us today in this conversation. In this chat, you will also hear how Nina's love for untravelled and niche destinations helped her to step out of her comfort zone, how she communicates with communities beyond the spoken word, what she learns from these communities, and how she brings these integral lessons into her life, and the 6-month adventure she's about to embark on. I also loved her biggest things you can't unhear moment, which she shares with us right at the end of this interview. So make sure you stay tuned till the end. Let me know what your biggest takeaway was from this conversation with me on Instagram at Things You Can't Unhear. And please, if you're listening and you love the show and you love this episode, we want to get it out to as many people as possible. So it would mean a lot if you shared a review on the Apple Podcast app or gave us a rating on the listening app you are tuning in from today. Thank you very much, Lee. Enjoy this conversation with Nina and let me know what you think. Right. Welcome, Nina Karnikowski, to the Things You Can't Unhear podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Now you're coming to us from Byron Bay and the weather is a bit rough, I hear. So
Wow.
please
Typhoon.
be patient, everyone. There may be a typhoon coming through Nina's window at some point. Hopefully not, but yeah, a bit dramatic.
Love the drama.
Yeah. Now, I'm thrilled that you're here because travel is something that I've just recently experienced again. And I've just come back from 2 weeks in Cambodia, actually. And I feel this, when you have those post-trip feels and you return back home. And two things happened for me. One is felt very grateful for the country that we live in. And number two, my thirst for adventure with purpose has just ignited on a different level. And, the trip that I experienced was quite different this time around to usual trips that I do. It had purpose, it had impact. We went out and worked with kids in Sunrise, Cambodia in the orphanage and had an amazing challenge with them on the streets of Phnom Penh. And there was lots of adventure and excitement that went with it as well. So I'd love to hear how your love of travel emerged, because it is probably one of the greatest things in life, isn't it?
Oh, it truly is. And it's just so nice to connect with other passionate travelers because it's just that kind of thing that you want to share, you want to talk about. We all know how good it feels when you get back from a trip and you just want to discuss everything that you learn and how it kind of impacted your life. So for me, it's interesting because I didn't grow up with a lot of travel at all. There was a lot of domestic travel, but it wasn't until really I lived in France when I was 21 as part of my journalism and international studies degree. And that was a year of, doing what all good Aussies do and traveling to as many countries as I possibly could in that European summer. I think it was like 14 in 3 months or something, doing the exact opposite of what I now talk about, but just so hungry for the world. And I came back from that trip and apparently I forgot about this, but a friend reminded me that I would say at university that I wanted to be the next Katrina Roundtree from Getaway.
What an epic job she has.
Right. And then I continued traveling until, and I was a lifestyle journalist at that point at Fairfax magazines. And I had that job for about 5 years before a in-house travel writer position came up, and I did whatever I needed to do to secure that position. And then it really became my livelihood. And so it was a mixture of my wildest dreams coming true and being squashed at the same time, because being a travel writer is sometimes not as easy as you think that it might be.
I can imagine that it would have its challenges. What were the biggest challenges for you, do you think?
So, for instance, the first assignment I ever went on was this meditation retreat in Bali, and it was really dreamy. And I remember being under a waterfall, sort of laughing on the last day. And then a few days later, I needed to be in New Zealand for this very luxury trip. And a couple of days in, we were about to have dinner at one of the 50 best restaurants in the world, and I started shivering and shaking uncontrollably. It turned out that I had contracted Giardia when I was under that waterfall laughing with my mouth open. And I really learned that when you're traveling on somebody else's dime and they're there to show you a good time so that you will write fondly about them, there is no getting sick. And so it was about just taking all of the Imodium and continuing on with the show and realizing, oh, okay, there are going to be some tough moments in that sense. And then really from there, I just my niche really became the far-flung corners of the world. I became very passionate about cultures and communities that were so different from the one that I had grown up in, and everything that they could teach me and the reader about the world. So really going to places like Mongolia to spend time with the nomads there, where, you know, there's 40% of the population is still living as nomads, or places like the Omo Valley in Ethiopia, or going to visit the Himba tribe in Namibia. And the learnings were usually quite similar, that we don't need as much as we think we do in order to be happy, that the globalized, industrialized system that we're living in has actually imposed an awful lot of stress and insecurity on a lot of us, and the beautiful localized way in which these communities are living actually had a lot of the keys to happiness. And also that idea of community and the power of community. I mean, not one of those places that I just mentioned were people living alone, and they were not doing anything on their own. They were all uniting to make the food and to create the houses, and they were always outside together. And I started to think, you know, we might go to those cultures and think, oh, these poor people, they don't have enough. But actually, a lot of the time, they are very abundant in ways that we could never imagine. And there's so much for us to learn from them. So that really became my passion at that time.
Yeah, I'm highly passionate about that. And obviously the blue zones that we talk about with Nick Buettner and Dan Buettner, they talk about communities being one of the keys to longevity. And we do lack that here. We are working so independently. We're a lot of the time on computer screens. We probably self-combust the moment the Wi-Fi goes down and our whole world shuts down and we can't communicate with anyone or work or operate. And then you go out to communities like this and you're like, hang on a moment. It's actually not that integral to our life operating smoothly. We can still operate in this year, in this century, without these things. It's fascinating to see it, isn't it?
It's so fascinating. And so you just reminded me of a moment that I had in Namibia with the Himba tribe. And I was there by myself. And I guess I was 36 or something at that point. And they could not understand. It was just me and my guide who was translating, could not understand that I was there by myself. Why are you here by yourself? Where is your husband? Why do you not have children? And they looked at me with such pity, because for them to be alone is essentially to not exist, because if they go out without anybody around them, they don't have all the skills to survive on their own. That's not how these societies are structured often. And also, it's dangerous to go out on your own. They're just always together. And I suddenly realized, yeah, this independence that we strive for so much, maybe it's not the best thing after all. And maybe it does create some kind of separation, and also our desire to have big, beautiful spaces that we then are very protective of. I hesitate to say that life is perfect in those places, because obviously there's hardships too. There's high infant mortality rates, there's often hunger, those sorts of things, of course. But I think it is important to question these things and to really think about what it means to live a good life and what success really is.
And also in the parenting realm too. I know a lot of people struggle. I have as well, raising kids and doing it alone. Obviously not alone completely. I've got a partner and he's been very supportive in that, but alone as in just us, just our family. And there in communities, in wider communities like this, children are raised by everyone. It's beautiful to see that.
That's right. And it's really hard for us to return to that now. I use the word return because I just went to an incredible Indigenous-led gathering called The Returning, which runs here on Bundjalung country in the Byron Shire. And it really tries to recreate that feeling of the village with a couple of hundred people, and you're learning Indigenous skills and wisdom from Indigenous leaders, and also living in that way where you would be all together. And it was such a beautiful experience. But at the same time, I thought, gosh, we are so attached to our independence and our small worlds, and building these kind of fortresses around them. So I think it might require a little bit of an opening for us to go, okay, can I actually let go of that feeling of independence? Can I actually invite people in a bit more, ask for help a little bit more? open up to that idea of maybe not being able to do everything on my own. And there could be something really beautiful on the other side of that.
I think a lot of people today are craving community so much. I hear it a lot from people in my orbit that community is something that they want more of, and they're yearning for, especially because we've been detached for a little while and we know what that feeling felt like. And I think, it's really important for us to find people that make us feel like that. And these are the lessons, like you said, that we can learn from traveling and integrate the parts that we like back into our lives in the best ways.
Yes, exactly. That's right. And put a mirror up against the system that we're living in that we think is so developed. That for me is a real, just over and over again, I found myself writing stories based around that same idea, different iterations of that, but really going, do we have all the answers? Because I'm not sure we do. So let's go back to those traditional ecological knowledges and see what might be there. And of course, this idea is now becoming a lot more widely recognized. But I think when I started thinking and talking about it 10 years ago now, it maybe was just sort of starting to be seeded. So it's really been beautiful to see that opening up.
Agreed. Now, you talk about going out to niche places and as a travel writer and a journalist, really wanting to find those places that are unseen and untouched. How did you go approaching that? I mean, it's very brave from your perspective to be able to go out and do that alone. I think a lot of people sort of shy away from that. So tell me sort of your mindset around that a little bit.
I love that question because I think people assume that I must be a really brave person, but I'm actually not. And that's a lot of what, on reflection, I've realized it was all about. So growing up, I was terrified of pretty much everything. I was afraid of animals. I was afraid of the ocean. I was afraid of other people. I was very shy. I was very scared. And then in my late teens, I developed a lot of anxiety. I was having panic attacks, that sort of thing. And that trip that I mentioned when I was 21 to the south of France was incredibly healing for me, because I realized that by pushing myself out of my comfort zone, which ironically had been the thing almost causing the anxiety, I felt so much more free. I felt so much more relaxed. I felt so much more myself. And so when it came to becoming at my job, I really stretched myself. Here's an example. I was terrified of flying. That was another thing. Travel writer, you need to fly. And often I would be going to countries in Africa, for instance, where there are very small planes. It was my worst nightmare. But slowly but surely, I started just pushing myself to go, no, get in the 6-seater plane. You have to. It's your job. And pushing through that, seeing that nothing terrible would happen. As a matter of fact, I felt incredibly empowered by doing those things. And so, traveling in India by myself, that's another thing I didn't feel incredibly comfortable with at first, but it was a muscle that I was flexing and going, okay, so that way that I approached it that time didn't work. What do I have to do next time? Oh, okay, I have to hold myself with a little more power. What does that look like? Going to do high altitude treks in Peru. I had to do one that was over 5,000 meters, which is very, very high altitude. And just going, this is essentially the scariest thing I've ever done, but it's one step at a time, literally on this trek. It is just incrementally going higher and higher. And I guess that's a bit of an analogy for what I was trying to do. And these days I experience very little anxiety because I've had to face all of these things. And I know how it feels to be incredibly uncomfortable and still be okay. And not only just be okay, but actually rise above to a new kind of level of embodiment and empowerment.
What a great lesson, though. And also, we don't all need to be Bear Grylls to be able to have these adventures. We can do them too. And you pretty much described me as a child too, being scared of everything. And the small plane situation, that's something that I've really pushed myself to get out of that fear as well, because it limits us. I was having conversations with someone recently who was too afraid to fly from one state to the next. She'd built up this fear. She couldn't get on a 2-hour flight back to see her family because she'd moved states. And it had been going for 2.5 years. And she said, this is getting ridiculous. I haven't been able to go and see my family. And I said, well, it's just one step. You need to take that first step and break out of that comfort zone. And she's liberated herself. Like you said, it's empowering to break out of that fear. But she has done that now. And the big smile on her face, seeing her family and those photos coming through was beautiful to witness, actually.
Oh, yes. I mean, we create our own prisons through our fear, really. We
Yeah.
get stuck in them and we think, oh, these four walls are keeping me safe. It's the opposite. It's actually when you open that door, and you don't have to open it all the way immediately. You can open it a crack, have a peek through. Is it safe? Put one hand out. Oh, actually, I'm all right. And keep moving forward. Like you say, one step at a time. You don't have to go from being terrified of flying to getting on a flight that's going to take 28 hours or something, but you can go, all right, maybe I'll take a half-hour one and see how that feels. Do it incrementally. And eventually you find yourself very far down the road looking back and going, wow, who was that terrified person? I love her, but I'm so glad I'm not her anymore.
It's so true. Now, I want to go back to these marginalized communities that you go out to visit. How do you communicate respectfully, ethically? How does that come about? Because it can be a lot of people obviously don't speak English as well, so it's hard to communicate how you are trying to interpret the information. Tell us a little bit about that from your angle.
Yes, this is, I think, to do with, first of all, being a little bit, again, brave with being uncomfortable, because it isn't always comfortable to not be able to speak the language of a place. For instance, I recently, about 18 months ago, spent time with a weaving community in northern India, and I lived with that community for a week. And only one out of the 100 women, the founder of the company, she could speak English, nobody else could. And she wasn't around a lot of the time. So I would just sit around in a circle with the women. A lot of the time they were laughing at me because it was just so hilarious that we're trying to sit there and communicate. And it was supremely uncomfortable at moments. But I think it's just dropping into it and going, we are all just humans. We are just humans sitting around together, and let's not take it too seriously if we're not getting the exact idea across. So smiles, gestures, all of these things can say so much. And I communicated with those women in ways that I will never forget. Eye contact, just gestures, all of those things. A lot can be said. And I think it's so important at a time when our language, we're being shown how limited our language is actually via things like social media, where we're kind of trying to like crunch it all down. And you realize when you come back to your humanness, there's so much more to communication than those words. I think another thing is really collaborating with people. So for instance, in Namibia, I had that incredible guide, and he was able to do a lot of the translation, so that particularly as a writer, I mean, I need to actually, receive some information, exchange some information with these people. So there's also that element, finding someone really good who can help you out in those situations, getting clear that you would like a guide who can help you with that. There's learning a few words yourself, although that, of course, can be limited in its extent of actual communication, but also very expansive in terms of people just love that you're trying. So even if you know 5 words, for instance, I lived in India for a year 10 years ago, and I probably only knew 10 words in Hindi that whole time. But when I would get in a taxi and say, I want to go here in Hindi, immediately smiles, open faces. Oh, do you speak Hindi? Unfortunately, I can't, but already you've made such a connection, and making that effort when you are the guest in someone else's country it goes so far.
Yeah, it's respect, isn't it? taking a quick minute to interrupt this conversation to let you know about something exciting I am growing. As you might know, I'm incredibly passionate about helping people to find and share their voice, especially if their voice is one that aims to create positive change in others. And I've launched a podcast network with purpose. It's called the Guide Your Light Network, that features podcasts and voices that inspire, educate, and transform listeners. And we have a library of podcasts that are part of our network that truly embody that mission, and we're looking for more. If this has sparked interest in you and you are ready to start exploring speaking and using your voice in this way, I'd love for you to check it out. Also, if you have something important to say and you don't know where to start to bring that to life, we can also help you to craft your authentic message through our Guide Your Light online sessions to help you get super clear on your intention, messaging, and structure needed to launch a podcast of your own that is authentically you. Just head over to guideyourlightnetwork.com. I think you're right too with the unspoken word is, I had this experience in Cambodia. We were out on the streets doing a challenge. I had 4 teenagers with me. None of them spoke a word of English, but the idea was that we sold what we had in this basket to people out in the street. It was their job to do it, and I was just supporting them. And the communication and the fun that we had on that afternoon was amazing. They'd sell something, we'd hug, we'd high five, we'd celebrate, we'd point to people, what about them? And it was like we had full conversations, but none of it was in words. It was beautiful to be a part of.
Oh, yes. And language is, again, that reminder that it's limited and that we have so much more scope. And I think it's a good reminder to bring home with you as well, because you realize how much you say with your body. You realize how much you say just through the expression on your face. And, when they say, I'm not going to get too woo-woo here, but you get what you give. If you're noticing that, people are responding really well to me, it might be because you're smiling more or your body looks more open, or, today people seem to be really cranky. Maybe it's actually you. Maybe you've got a sour expression on your face and you look closed down. So I think that just more generally is a really important thing to remember in terms of being a human being in the world.
Yeah, you just made me have a flashback of me walking through the school drop-off gates with my kids, and I always have a big smile on my face, and people would gravitate towards me because I always had a big smile on my face. And one of the mums says, "Why is everyone talking to you?" I was like, aren't they talking to everyone? I'm confused. She's like, because you've got that smile on your face all the time.
That is such a good example there. It's happening. It works.
Exactly. Now I want to talk about conscious travel, because this is something that you have become very passionate about in more recent years. Obviously, having the experience that you have in the past with the loads of travel that you've done. Tell us about that transition into that awareness around conscious travel and what it means.
Okay. Well, I did have an aha moment, but I'm going to backtrack a little bit before that. So during those travels that I was describing, there would be those incredible moments with those communities, but there were also other moments that were less dreamy. For instance, going to Borneo and seeing the vast hectares upon hectares of palm oil plantations and realizing the degradation that was happening because of those to old growth forests, or snorkeling on a reef there and seeing that actually it was all dead. And this was because of the warming of the ocean and because of fishing techniques, all these sorts of things. And so I was receiving little kind of nudges about how our kind of consumptive behaviors were impacting upon the planet. But I suppose at that point, I wasn't willing to look at my contribution to that. I would just say, isn't this awful? Okay, it's good to be aware of it and just continue on. Now, all of that changed when I went to the Arctic. So this was in 2019. I was sent on an assignment to a place called Churchill, which is otherwise known as the polar bear capital of the world. It's incredible with during the summer season, there's 900 polar bears, 800 human inhabitants. So you can imagine what kind of things happen. People can wake up with polar bears in their kitchen or on the play equipment outside of their house. And it was such a moving trip because we came very close to the polar bears, and I'm talking eye contact close. And then, later that day, after making eye contact with a polar bear, I'm learning in the education center about how their feeding seasons are becoming shorter because of the warming of our planet, which impacts their ability to breed, which then impacts the population and impacts their weight and all sorts of things. And I remember sitting at the airport on the way home from that trip and looking around at these thousands of people rushing off to thousands of planes, including me, and thinking, okay, I am contributing to this. The polar bears can do nothing to change their situation, but I can do something to change their situation, or at least do my bit for it and to try to raise awareness. And went home, did some research into the impact that travel has on the natural world. It causes something like 8% of carbon emissions, and obviously leads to degraded wilderness areas, and there's problems with over-tourism and all these sorts of things. But I also was aware of the fact that it accounts for 1 in 10 jobs around the world, and it obviously opens our minds and our hearts, and all of those things that I had learned from all of those cultures. They are incredibly important lessons that if we were all closed off from one another, how would we ever exchange those ideas? So I knew this was a thing that needed to continue happening. We needed to continue traveling, but how could we do it in a way that was less impactful? And when I was looking also at the expanding numbers of travelers, I mean, we've got a really ballooning population, flights are very cheap. There's a different way of traveling now than when we were traveling, say, 50 years ago. It's much more consumptive now. And that was a thing that really stood out for me. So I made a decision on that day that I would not travel for a while. And I sent an email off to my editors and I said I needed some time off. And then I couldn't find many resources on how to proceed when I was ready in a way that was more beneficial to the communities and ecologies that I was visiting. And so I pitched a book to my publisher, because I had already written a book before on sustainable travel. And I learned about how to do it by writing about it. And so that was, I sort of say that it was my greatest adventure of my life thus far. And it really was, because there was so much that I didn't know, so much inspiring information about what we can do as travelers to benefit local communities, and in a way that was not actually taking away from the experience, but making our travel experiences that much richer.
And was that before the forced break from travel that we all had, or during?
Yes, good question. So this was about 4 months before the pandemic when I actually filed that book. I filed it. I was in my head thinking, okay, now I have all the resources to proceed in the right way. I was about to go forth, and I think I was going to go to the Stans, and I was going to do this very long trip, because that's what I had made the decision to do. If I was going to burn that carbon, I would go and stay for longer and do a much more expanded trip, and then come home and write about that and do 1 or 2 trips a year as opposed to the 12 that I was doing before. And just when I had made that decision to go, the pandemic hit, the world shut down. And that was such an interesting time for travel, because it was twofold. We realized how much we loved it and how much we missed it, and how much it was part of so many of our identities. And that was particularly impactful for people like me, whose livelihoods and lives revolved around travel. But at the same time, we also noticed that actually there wouldn't be a world worth seeing in the future if we didn't start seeing it in the right way now. And there was a lot of talk at that time about how it could be, the pandemic could be this portal into a clean, green world of travel. Unfortunately, I think we've slid back a little bit from that, but there is still a lot of momentum with the more, whatever you want to call it, sustainable. There's the word regenerative being used now. I call it mindful. There's conscious. There's just this new wave of people who are caring about the way in which we see the world.
So what do you suggest to people if they want to be conscious travelers? What steps can they take to be a part of the solution?
There's so many things you can do. So basically in that first book, it was called Go Lightly. I kind of crammed in, because I was in that learning phase, just hundreds of things that we can do. And this is from saying no to the single-use plastics on the plane and packing less so that, you know, your emissions are slightly reduced, or offsetting, for instance, your emissions from your flight, to the much bigger picture things. So for me, those bigger picture things are things like putting nature at the center of your adventures, because of course, a lot of people do not live in naturally abundant places. And so we protect what we love. So if we go to a place that is naturally very beautiful and we're hiking and we're getting out in nature, we're falling in love with it. And when we come home, we're much more prepared to fight for it. So for instance, my experience in the Arctic, that kind of thing can happen for people when they're doing that. But really, an incredibly important thing is to put money into the pockets of locals. So there's figures ranging from sort of 85 to 95% of our travel dollars that we spend in a destination, they leak out of that destination and into the pockets of multinational corporations. So that means you have to be a little bit more savvy as a traveler. You need to know who owns the businesses and look for really small, locally owned businesses. So hotels, restaurants, tour companies, and invest your money into those so that the travel dollars are staying in those local pockets. And I mean, that makes for incredibly rich experiences, because then you're with the community, you're learning directly from them. They're the trips you will never forget. You know, for instance, I went on a weaving trip to Guatemala some years back, where we spent a week with the artisans learning about this traditional weaving practice that is in danger of dying out. But a traveler can come and be interested in that and put their money into safeguarding that tradition while learning how to weave something, learning how that cotton is actually made, how it's dyed with natural materials. And then you never come home looking at a piece of clothing the same way again, because you realize what it takes to create something like that. And that's a trip I will never forget. Like, do I remember every detail of, say, the 5 days that I spent in Paris one time to kind of write a story about the launch of the cultural season? No, I don't remember it, because it was so fast. I wasn't that passionate about it. But then contrast that to something where you're really embedded with the local community and it's just a world apart.
We had that experience in Fiji when I lived there for 10 months as well, and just being really immersed in the community was so beautiful. And the weaving and learning how to shave coconuts and doing all of the things that they do. It's just so eye-opening and fascinating. But you mentioned, you know, stepping away and spending money in the local community. And that's something that we picked up too in Cambodia. Is you want to go for a massage, don't book it in the hotel. Go out into the streets and book it in one of the small businesses that are operating. Number one, they're probably better, they're cheaper, and the money goes directly to them. But I've heard you talk about booking travel as well, and the way that we book travel. So we're better off obviously going direct to hotels rather than through umbrella platforms that are taking probably a huge chunk of that booking fee.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it's really about doing the research, right? Because there are some incredible big companies that are very focused on what they call community-based tourism. So they are going to the small operators, because let's face it, a lot of people can't find those small operators because maybe they don't have a website, maybe they don't have that kind of capacity. So there are companies, to name a few, say G Adventures or World Expeditions or Intrepid, like they all make the effort to really do that. They're very transparent in, okay, this is the amount of money that we put back into the local communities, and they're, you know, trying to be either carbon neutral or carbon negative. You're looking for all of those things. You're looking for B Corp certified companies. There's another one called Much Better Adventures that I haven't traveled with personally, but they sound amazing with what they do. Otherwise, it's really just doing the Google and getting very granular in your research, and that's part of the fun. You know, I think we can get a little bit lazy sometimes these days with that research, but allow it to be an expanded version of your trip. You know, when you start to do that research and you feel as though you're already in the place a month before you go, because you're speaking to people there, you're looking all of these companies up, you're getting excited about the things that you can do. And so I think just using those key phrases, you know, community-based tourism, those sorts of things, and don't be afraid to reach out to companies and say, how much money goes to the local community, or, you know, who owns this business, or who owns this hotel, those sorts of things. And then, you know, other things you can do are, of course, there's looking at hotels that are made with recycled materials, or that have amazing grey water programs for the water that they've used, or that might involve permaculture in their gardens, so that all of the whole place is a closed loop system. You know, like I stayed in a place in Sumba in Indonesia that is very under touristed, that island. That's another good thing. You go to the more under touristed island than the over touristed one. And that place, it was called Nalankala. It was a surf retreat, and it was fully its own little ecosystem. So the bungalows were made out of the plants that were growing on the property. All of their food came from their food garden, or if they caught fish that day, you would eat it. If they didn't, you wouldn't. All of the staff were local. You know, those sorts of places just make trips unforgettable, and they're so beneficial for the communities.
It's asking the right questions, isn't it? And that's what, for me, being conscious is going into something and looking at it from your own point of view, without judgment or cloudiness or opinions or other people's insights.
That's exactly right. And remaining curious. You know, I think it can be off-putting for people because they think, oh, I don't want to be the difficult one, but it's actually not that at all. It's like, that's what travel teaches us, to be curious. Hey, who's behind this? I want to know more. Tell me more. That's you're already practicing opening to that awe and wonder, which is one of the most beneficial things of all with travel, is that it opens us up to look at the whole world that way. And can begin in those planning stages.
Yeah. And even like you said, you know, not booking that well-known island in Italy, perhaps going, which other island is nearby that I could go to that is probably less populated, less touristy. You'll get more of the authenticity of the experience, rather than going, we had this exact experience in Italy with Positano and Tropea. Did we go to Positano? We went to both, and they were just polar opposites considering how close they were to each other. It was like we were possibly in England when we went to Positano, because I didn't hear anyone speaking Italian, but it was all tourists. And then you go to Tropea and it's just so authentic and grounding, and, you know, you're part of the Italian experience a lot more.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I bet you have incredible stories from that. And that's what I think about with travel. It's all about kind of collecting these stories to offer our future selves, our grandchildren, that sort of thing. And, I wrote a memoir at the end of last year called The Mindful Traveler. And I tried to really bring this idea to life through story, recognizing that travel is all about that. So these experiences lead to more of those stories. Like, for another example, I went to Nepal about 18 months ago, and I stayed in a place called the Happy House, which is the mid-Himalayas, this little stacked stone Sherpa house. The stories that came out of that place, I mean, we're with the local Sherpa community hiking through a place called the Magic Forest to go and stay in this Gur camp on this ridge top, and hearing stories about the first Italian to ever summit Everest with 6,000 porters who came to stay in the happy house and left his Edwardian gambling table there. And we're looking at that Edwardian gambling table and hearing all these incredible stories. I mean, you're not going to get that story at the Hilton, put it that way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the stories are what evoke the emotion and the memory, right? So it's just, I could listen to your stories all day. It is, listening to people's travel stories isn't always exciting when they are telling you about what they ate and, how they sat by the pool and the cocktails. Listening to this and hearing the stories that you are absorbing when you go, it is just it's definitely igniting another passion. I actually put up on my Instagram page as a joke the other day, well, sort of serious, but I was joking at the time, if anyone wants to pay me to travel, I am available, just slide into my DMs. And my daughter wrote back and she said, Mum, can you actually do this for a living? I said, yes, darling, I literally listed all the jobs that you could be involved in travel. And she's like, fascinating, ... Like may have sparked something within her as well.
Now she'll be the one saying, I want to be the next Katrina Roundtree.
Correct. Well, you've pretty much, kicked that goal yourself. And do you even know how many countries you've been to? Have you got a way of recording it?
Well, I think that it has been over 60. And, like I say, I mean, things have really slowed down over the past few years for the obvious reasons, but also because I now have this ethos of traveling less but better. So, for instance, I am leading a trek in Nepal in April for World Expeditions, and then there'll be another one in September. There are still spots for that if anybody wants to come. And my husband and I thought, you know what? Should we just stay in between those two and we figured out how to make that happen? Because honestly, we can make whatever we want to happen in life happen if we want it badly enough. And so we're staying there for 6 months. We're going to be in the Himalayas for that whole time and really just gathering those stories. We can work remotely and understanding that it's when we have those longer periods of time that we make those deeper connections that travel is all about. Just like your story about Fiji, then these places become part of us. We return again and again, and we build really good relationships with people in those places, which has definitely been my experience in Nepal. And this is not to say that everybody has to go off and spend 6 months, but maybe you can look at your next 1-week trip and go, okay, could I borrow a bit more leave and stay for double that time? And can I slow the travels down, which is another real key to this kind of travel, and maybe not go to 5 places in those couple of weeks, but go to 1 or 2 and really embed yourself in that local community when you're there.
How wonderfully exciting for you to be able to be having that adventure with your husband as well, and committing to that time. I've got another friend I was talking to yesterday who's doing the same in Ireland, and she's taking her 13-year-old daughter over. She's committed to doing it. She's separated from her partner, but he's also agreed to come over. So they've worked that out amicably as well, so that they both have access to their daughter. And it was something that probably seemed impossible for her, but she's navigated a way to make it happen and work remotely as well. And it's not always easy to make it happen. I remember when we were planning the Fiji element of our move, and it just sounded ridiculous when you were telling people sort of in 2020 that you were moving and going to another country and developing nation as well. But it was one of the best experiences that I've ever had. And it's we on average live around 75, 80 years. If you spend a year or two abroad, how wonderful. How many stories can you come back with?
Maritza, I love hearing that. Yes. And my advice to anyone listening who's thinking, yes, but still how? So what we did was we went, okay, this seems impossible. There's these very obvious roadblocks. There is the dog. There is the house. There is the lack of finances to do it. There is the job. And we just wrote down those 4 main things, and we systematically went through and made sure that there was a way to deal with all of them. So rented the house out so we can kind of help out with the finances that way. We can both work remotely. My husband required a little bit more wrangling with his team to make that happen, but got there in the end. And, you know, the dog was a bit of negotiation with my parents. But look at your friend with a 13-year-old daughter and was able to make that happen. It's just that thing of looking at the blocks. And I think this applies to all of life and going, what narrative am I telling myself that is not true? And really just turning that around and going, is this a reason not to go? Or is this just my fear showing up? And is there a way to actually embed this into the plan and just make what you want to happen happen?
And 6 months or 3 months really isn't a long time. Like,
No.
back to November, that was 6 months ago. That felt like 5 minutes ago. And
Yeah.
I think you'll probably attest to this too. When you do go away for a while and come back, you realize not a lot changes in the place that you are living in anyway. So you can miss things, but you don't miss that much. And you are still enriched with all of these incredible experiences to come back and share with everyone as well. Yeah, I totally am a huge advocate of doing an adventure like that, an escape like that, and just, learning about yourself in that way.
Yes. And, pulling I always call it like the escape hatch, when life suddenly starts to feel a little robotic, a little same, and you think, okay, can I pull that cord, open the escape hatch? And it doesn't have to be as dramatic, even as going to another country for 6 months, but can I shift things up in my life to move out of that? Because we are human beings, we are not robots, and to move back into that real flow of life where we are being a bit more nimble, all of these things that we're taught in those situations when we're kind of, we don't have all of the tight constraints around us. It can be a little scary, but can be incredibly liberating too. And I think it's an important practice for us.
Yeah, well, I can't wait to hear and see the documentation of that adventure on your end. I'm sure you'll be sharing on your social channels and in other ways as well.
Oh, yes. Even though I'm constantly saying, okay, one of the keys to traveling this way is being very present. And this is the basis of the trek that I'm running, where we're not taking a million photos the whole time. But then there is also the other side of that, of like the creation element that can come out of these sorts of times, and how taking some really beautiful imagery and documenting can be such a way to actually understand what the story is in that place, or what life means to the community there. So that's
inspiring us who are sitting at home to have that adventure too.
Right. And isn't that our job to do for one another, is just expand our ideas of what we can do in our life?
Brilliant. I love it. I've loved every part of this. I will ask everyone this question. What is something that you once heard that you could not unhear, perhaps on your travels or in remote communities? But yeah, I'd love to hear.
I had a beautiful conversation with Celine Cousteau, who is an activist and an environmentalist and a filmmaker, also the granddaughter of the famous explorer Jacques Cousteau. And I interviewed her for one of my books, and she told this story of a chief in an Amazonian village who pointed to a tree, and he said, one day that tree will make a great canoe, not for me, not for my son, not for my grandson, maybe my grandson's son or his grandson. And she said, we used to think several generations ahead. We need to return to that. And that phrase has really been the key to so much of my thinking, looking back to the past, looking back to the way that we used to do things for the answers to some of life's most pressing questions.
That is absolutely beautiful. And what a perfect way to end. What a great reflection. Thank you so much, Nina, for sharing everything today. You've sparked something again. Watch out, people. My mum said to me when I came back from Cambodia, are you going to be moving there now? Is that what you're doing? I can't keep track. I said, no, we're not moving to Cambodia. Don't worry. But definitely, yeah, a lot more travel to beautiful destinations that are maybe, untapped.
I've loved this discussion. Thank you so much for having me, Maritza.
You're welcome. I'll share your details in our show notes so people can connect with you and also follow your upcoming adventures. Thanks again, Nina.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the show. What did you think? And what did you feel? Let us know by leaving me a message on the Things You Can't Unhear Instagram community page. And if you can, give us some ratings love on your favourite listening platform.